Hi, my name is Hazel Marzetti and I'm a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Edinburgh. And today I'm going to be talking to you about my PhD research looking at young LGBT+ people's suicidal thoughts and attempts in Scotland. International research tells us that young LGBT+ people are somewhere between 2 and 4 times more likely than cisgender heterosexual young people to think about or attempt suicide. But there is not much research on experiences of suicidal distress amongst young LGBT+ people living in the UK, and even less so on those living in Scotland. But perhaps even more importantly, there is very little known about why this difference exists in the first place. And this is what my research begins to try and address. So in this video, I'm going to try and give you a brief overview of what I did for my research and what my findings were. I undertook narrative interviews with 24 young LGBT+ people who had thought about or attempted suicide. Those young people came from all across Scotland, from the borders up to the Highlands, with lots of stops along the way. Together, we talked about what they felt had added to their suicidal distress, what they felt helped keep them safe from suicide, and what they believed would reduce LGBT+ youth suicide in Scotland. Participants in my research talked about can be somewhat separated into 2 categories. Firstly, there were things that have been found to affect young people regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, such as educational difficulties or adverse childhood experiences, such as childhood abuse or neglect. And then there were some more LGBT+ specific experiences, such as homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic bullying, difficult experiences around coming out, particularly when families were not accepting of young people's LGBT+ identity. But together, these often happened within communities that were considered by young people narrow-minded, in which everyday comments and questions reminded them that LGBT+ people were considered different. The important part of this is that although these can be considered somewhat separate, they were also linked. So for example, if your home life was already difficult because of experiences of abuse or neglect, then coming out could feel even more challenging. Similarly, if you were facing homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia across multiple areas of your life, it could begin to feel to participants like they had no safe space in which to exist. When this was the case, for some people, school achievement could become a very important avenue for escape by doing well and moving away to university. But this in turn could add additional pressure to an environment in which, if young people were already facing bullying from their peers, could be a really difficult place to be. Altogether, the weight of these pressures happening at the same time could feel extremely heavy and could begin to feel unmanageable and inescapable. And it was within these contexts that suicidal distress began to form. The other thing that we were really interested in was what keeps people safe from suicidal distress and helps to keep them alive. This could be broadly split into 2 parts. Firstly, connecting to the broader LGBT+ community, either through online spaces such as social media, or offline spaces through educational or youth groups specific to LGBT+ young people. This was really important for inspiring participants with hope for the future, reducing isolation, and providing a link to LGBT+ communities and culture. Secondly, through mental health support. And whilst ideally this would have been provided by mental health professionals, often participants described a need for immediately accessible support during the time of a suicidal crisis to distract away from feeling suicidal. And therefore, this was usually provided by either charitable sector organisations such as the Samaritans or Childline, or by participants' peers, so other young people, often LGBT+ young people. We also asked participants what they believed would reduce LGBT+ youth suicide in Scotland in the future. Firstly, participants wanted increased and improved mental health support, which for them meant reducing waiting times and improving LGBT+ awareness amongst mental health professionals. But further to this, because participants in this study, consistent with findings across a range of research, often relied on their friends for support with their mental health, both during times of crisis and on an ongoing basis, some participants suggested that it might be useful to support young people who were providing peer support, both to strengthen their skills for listening and supporting, but also to help them look after themselves whilst doing so. Secondly, they told me that we needed to see homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia taken seriously and tackled, both reactively by challenging it when it happened, but additionally, because homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia were not seen as shocking, it was not seen as out of character in the places where participants lived. Instead, it was understood by participants as expected, as ordinary, as consistent with, and an extension of the everyday comments and questions that positioned LGBT+ people as different. Participants also stated that there could be proactive representation and inclusion of LGBT+ people throughout their everyday lives. As the starting point, they suggested that this could happen in schools, for example, by proactively including LGBT+ people throughout the educational curriculum, which is something that has been recently introduced in Scotland, and we're really interested to see how that kind of continues. But what I think is particularly interesting about these findings is that it really changes our framing of what suicide prevention is. Because very often when we think about suicide prevention, we think about emergency or crisis support, and things like LGBT+ inclusion on the curriculum are considered too distant from a suicidal crisis to be taken into account. However, for young people in this study, it was exactly that kind of work that needed to be undertaken in order to reduce homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia in wider society that they then felt would have helped to make their lives easier to live. And so that's a really important learning point, I think, for us as suicide researchers.